Welcome to Maritime Security Challenges webinar number 11. For our viewers around the world, we are delighted to provide this insight into the Russian-Ukraine war and the way it is having a profound effect on Russia's maritime warfare. This series, Maritime Security Challenges, originated in 2005. And over the space of almost 15 years, we had 9 conferences. But of course, as you can appreciate, these conferences were interrupted by the advent of the COVID pandemic. And so we have turned to a webinar format in a highly successful series of interventions by world experts. I'd like today to thank our sponsors for today's presentation: Lockheed Martin, MDA, General Dynamics, Hawkeye 360, and Davie Shipbuilding. And I'd particularly like to thank MSC Partners, the Navy League of Canada, and the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Our speaker today is a world authority on Russia's maritime power, its naval activities and influence globally. He is an associate professor at the US Naval War College, and Dr. Michael Petersen is the director of the Russia Maritime Studies Institute. Much to my delight, I was trained as a historian. I see that he published some years ago through Cambridge University Press a study of the Third Reich and its missile program at Peenemünde, a book that I'm about to order almost immediately. Today, as you can appreciate, as a result of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the issue of maritime power and Russia's interests at sea is exceedingly important and topical. Let me make 3 very quick observations. First, that the Russians are the victims of geography. Russia is vast, and it is flanked by seas: the Sea of Okhotsk in the Pacific, the Barents Sea, the Black Sea, and the Baltic Sea. And their fleets are divided accordingly. Secondly, although Russia is enormous and is seen as a great power, it has an economy which many would suggest is roughly equal to that of Italy. Some would suggest of New York State. And lastly, that when we look at the enormous maritime list of vessels that Russia has, what we see is that there are really 2 fleets, an old fleet and a new fleet. But enough said about the broad generalities of Russia. I'd like to ask the audience if they have questions at any time to submit them so that they can be collated by the webinar staff and we can address them in the Q&A portion. I'm going to ask Dr. Petersen to make his presentation, which will last for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll break for the question and answer session. So it's with great pleasure and delight that I turn to Dr. Michael Petersen from the US Naval War College, an expert on Russian naval operations and strategy, to brief us today on the relationship between the events unfolding in Ukraine and Russia's changing maritime warfare. Dr. Petersen, please.
Jim, thank you so much for those really kind remarks. I really do sincerely appreciate it. And I am honored to be here to speak with you all. And I'm thrilled that I'm able to stay in touch with some people who I would consider my friends that I made back at MSC. I think it was 2018 over in Victoria. And it was just a great conference, and I'm looking forward to heading out there again this fall. I know it's going to be another tremendous event. So what I'm going to do is share my slides with you quickly here, first of all, and I plan to talk about Russia as Russia's naval warfighting strategy and how that kind of applies itself in large-scale wars, but also what the war in Ukraine kind of tells us about whether or not Russian naval strategy, warfighting strategy is validated, what insights Russia may be gaining from that, what mistakes they've made, and what we can learn from all that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the very top level with some very general statements about Russian military strategy, and then slowly work it down into some more narrow discussion about Russian operational issues and operational warfighting, and then we'll talk about Ukraine. So there's a lot of ground to cover, and will be whatever I cover in an unsatisfactory way, I hope we can cover in the question and answer session. I will begin by saying that these are my remarks alone. They're not those of the US Navy. So everything I tell you is my own opinion and not an official position held by the US Navy. So hopefully you can all see my screen. And I'm showing a slide now that's headed Russian military strategy. So I'm just going to proceed. There's a lot of words on this slide. There's going to be a lot of words on the next few slides. I'm not going to repeat them all to you. But there are a couple of big top level takeaways here that I think we should pay attention to. The most important thing, if you take anything off of this slide, is what Russia prioritizes in terms of warfighting strategy. They prioritize defending their own critical infrastructure against specifically aerospace attack, but other forms of attack as well. When I say aerospace attack, I mean attacks that can be generated from the maritime domain, but generally occur with long-range precision strike or other precision strike capabilities that may be resident either in an Air Force or a Navy. And they prioritize defending that critical infrastructure in what's called the initial period of war. Now, that's a very Russian concept, and we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. The other big priority that I hope you'll take away from this is that they prioritize destroying the adversary's critical, what they call objects. Sometimes in the West, we retranslate the term as targets, but the actual Russian word is obyektov, that is of objects. So they're looking for critical objects that will have a strategic effect on the enemy. And again, they're looking to do that in the initial period of war. One of the really important things to think about is that Russian planners and strategists understand that in a one-to-one fight against NATO, they can't win. So what they try to do instead is to leverage certain advantages that they may have and moving quickly, creating other operational strategic concepts that will allow them to exploit the advantages that they have and minimize their weaknesses and get out of there without too much trouble and without too much loss. A couple other quick points that I'd like to make here. Under assumptions, one of the things we often see on maps of Russian warfighting, maps that depict Russian warfighting ranges and range rings of air defense systems or coastal defense cruise missile systems are these big angry red rings. Now, those big angry red rings are not no-go zones, right? They're often depicted as such. But if you read Russian strategists and read Russian military philosophers and read the planners, what they will tell you is that they know that those attacks cannot be sort of stopped at the door, so to speak. They know that what they want to try to do is deflect those attacks, to disorganize those attacks, to impose as much cost on those attacks prior to actually those attacks sort of landing at their targets, even though they know that whatever attacks they're likely to face, they will not be able to stop all of them. So they're going to prioritize defense of critically important targets and also try to get after imposing cost. And we'll talk about that sort of cost imposition strategy here in a few minutes. So it is really critically important to understand that Russia wants to defend its own important infrastructure and destroy the adversary's infrastructure. War, in a nutshell, to Russia is a contest over critical infrastructure. And hopefully you'll be able to keep that in your head as we proceed here. So, as I mentioned, Russia focuses on cost imposition. And then on damage limitation as well. So this sort of combination of cost imposition and damage limitation, you can maybe be able to see where I'm going here. It's a sort of blending of offense and defense. So even in peacetime or in the run-up to a war, the military can threaten to impose costs that are unacceptable to its adversaries. And that's a way that Russia believes is a good avenue toward deterrence. So it's a really cost imposition strategy when you're thinking about deterrence, but it's also cost imposition in wartime. If a war were to break out, they believe that they can find just the right kinds of targets that can make their adversary say, "Uncle, this is too much. That's enough. We can't do this anymore." They do not believe that their adversaries will have the political will, particularly in the West, here in the US and maybe in European countries, will have the political will to carry on a war with Russia because they can impose enough cost. Whether or not that's an accurate statement in reality is a different question, but this is what Russian planners and Russian sort of military philosophers believe to be true. That they can impose enough cost that political will to carry on a conflict sort of drains out the bottom and is absent, and their adversary will hope to say uncle in a conflict. Last thing about this slide is that the Navy is a really important component of that. And you might imagine why, but if you don't, I will get to that in just a minute. I mentioned that Russia wants to move quickly. The reason why they want to move quickly is that force mismatch that I also mentioned. Now, there's a lot of words on the slide here again, but Gerasimov himself has been very explicit about this idea of moving fast and seizing the strategic initiative. You don't need to read the entire slide. You just need to read the underlined words, right? Proactively neutralize, preempt the enemy, preventive measures. This is what Russia this is one of the sort of basic concepts that is at the core of Russian strategic and operational military thinking. Strategically, they're going to move faster than their adversary and gain or win those crucial gains early in a conflict that will allow them to then ask the adversary, rhetorically speaking, I suppose, are you sure you want to do this? This is the sort of thing you really want to carry on. And then operationally, same thing. They believe that they can get out in front of their adversary by conducting critical conventional attacks against that, against sort of call it critical C2 nodes and other targets that will allow them to stay operationally ahead of their adversary. Again, Ukraine has cast some doubt on that, but that's the philosophy in any case. A couple of more basic terms in Russian military strategy. One is the threatening period. That's exactly what it sounds like. But the critical point here is that in the 21st century, the Russians believe that the threatening period of war is going to be extremely short or non-existent. They have studied the history of US warfighting since 1991, since the first Gulf War, and they've made some determinations about that warfighting. One of them is that it's often the case that the threatening period of war is going to be very short, and the US can use its long-range precision-guided munitions from forward-staged positions to eliminate their adversary. Now, the Russians have taken a page out of that playbook, and they believe kind of the same thing now. So they believe that pushing forces forward is the proper response to an American force deployment in the threatening period. So the Russians can have forces forward and threaten to impose the kinds of damage that they believe will be critical to victory. That leads to the initial period of war, which is a classic sort of enduring Russian strategic military concept. It goes back to the 1920s. But again, the critical piece about understanding the initial period of war in the 21st century is that it will be fought by forces that are deployed before the war begins, often just forces that are in place. And if you think about this, it begins to explain Russia's forward strategy in places like the Arctic. They are there, forces, they're building these new bases in the Arctic, for example, for two reasons. Number one, they believe they need to have forces forward for homeland defense, but also those forces forward can serve as a staging area, as a jumping off area for other attacks, for offensive operations, should the need arise. And they want to seize all of their primary objectives, as many as they can, in the initial period of war. Again, because they believe that a long war is not necessarily in their interest. They know that they lack the industrial capacity and the economic capacity to kind of keep up a long war against the NATO alliance, given the mismatch, the economic mismatch that Jim Boutilier was mentioning before. So I will not go over every single word in this slide, but this is a basic sort of digest of what the Russian Ministry of Defense website itself says. So in the threatening period, what are the Navy's roles? Mobilization, deterrence of conflict, local conflict isolation. That's important because we see that happening right now in Ukraine. The reason why there are many Russian naval vessels currently deployed to the Mediterranean is to isolate the conflict, to make sure that the conflict does not metastasize into something NATO-wide into the Mediterranean, to keep other NATO forces kind of at arm's length. It's one of the reasons why they're there. In the initial period of war and in wartime, again, these are tasks that for the Navy that are set out by the Ministry of Defense on its website. You can go there right now and look at it if you want to, though I don't necessarily recommend it. Standoff land attack is really interesting. It's the first thing that's listed on the list of tasks for the Russian Navy. Of course, protection of their strategic nuclear bastion is important, but also attacking adversary ASW forces and other tasks associated with that, including maritime support for troops ashore, which of course we're seeing in Ukraine. Now, the Russians have been very clear about this standoff land attack mission. In their naval fundamentals, which is a sort of official guiding operational document, it states very clearly that the Navy's task is to attack the critically important ground-based facilities of the adversary without violating until a certain moment its national sovereignty. That is official naval operational policy, written into a document signed by President Putin himself. Same thing in that document. It also states that because Russia has high precision weapons, the Navy faces, and this is really interesting phrasing, a qualitatively new objective: destruction of the enemy's military and economic potential by striking its vital facilities from the sea. Some Russian naval analysts have deemed this strategy the ship against the shore. So that's a really critical piece. But it doesn't get at all of the sort of warfighting missions that the Russian Navy has laid out for itself. Of course, they want to fight other navies as well, but that's just not necessarily the central, most important piece anymore. The Navy has many, many missions, but when they do think about Navy on Navy conflict, they think very clearly through the kind of same lens. So they're thinking about preemption. They're thinking about striking critical targets. They're thinking about finding those targets that will impose the most cost, both militarily, possibly economically, and definitely politically. So those targets can include, this is a Russian phrasing, maritime carriers that are global strike assets. That means US nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and maritime components of the US National Missile Defense System. That is BMD-equipped destroyers and cruisers. So from that perspective, the Russians have a very sort of, I wouldn't want to call it a strict target set, but they've got some pretty good prioritization in mind for the kinds of things that they want to attack at sea. So can the Russian Navy deliver on all of this? It's a major question. That's a lot of philosophy, a lot of thinking. The question is, does the Russian Navy have the ability to deliver on that? And I would argue that their ability to do that depends on three different things. One is geography, and thank you, Jim, for mentioning that before. Another is ISRT, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and targeting. And finally, the order of battle, particularly order of battle when it comes to missile shooting platforms. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's talk about geography first. Geographers have a concept called the loss of strength gradient. And the loss of strength gradient is a unit of competitive or combat power that is lost per some unit of distance from your home shores. So the farther away you go, the weaker you become, and the farther away you go from your home shores. Now there are ways to get get past this, right? Forward basing is one, allies is another, and more forward deployments is always an interesting way to sort of get past this. But Russia, of course, lacks almost all of that, with the possible exception, of course, of Syria and maybe sometime in the future, Sudan. Quite a set of allies to have. Certainly not Canada, the UK, or France, or anybody else in the NATO alliance, for that matter. So in any case, geography is critically important here, and the Russian naval thinkers divide up the sea, the oceans, the world's oceans, into three basic areas. Now, there's no sort of neat line delineating these basic areas. And if you talk to different naval strategists, they'll give you a different sort of general impression of what these are. But overall, if you take it all in total, this is what they are. So the red is what they would call the coastal and the near sea zones. And in those coastal and near sea zones, that's where you would see the most combat power generated, particularly from the shore, but also, of course, at sea with smaller surface combatants and diesel submarines. But you also see, of course, large surface combatants and larger nuclear-powered submarines as well from Russia. Now, in the near sea to far sea zone, in the EUCOM area of operations, that would include the Norwegian Sea, into the GI-UK gap, sort of out into the central and western Mediterranean. That's the sort of, you might consider that to be the sort of near sea to far sea zone. You would see larger surface combatants there, possibly, and certainly you would see, we know that historically, certainly you would see nuclear-powered submarines, nuclear-powered cruise missile submarines, and sort of typical nuclear-powered torpedo shooting submarines. Of course, we would also see, and this is a critically important piece, intermediate range maritime strike aircraft. And here I'm thinking in particular of the Tu-22 backfires. Finally, out into the far sea zone, you see much more limited use of nuclear-powered submarines, whether they're cruise missile shooting or not. Just far fewer, because they lack the order of battle to push a large number of submarines out there when they have to concern themselves with defense of the near sea and far sea zone and the coastal and coastal to the near sea zone. So it's really much more limited, and large surface combatants are highly unlikely to operate in those environments because their survivability is extremely limited. So in short, when it comes to long-range precision strike warfare, Russia's logistics and sustainment and striking power decrease with distance. Now, I think we'll see some interesting sort of wrinkles on this when we get to the Ukraine problem. So very, very quickly, I'm going to proceed through this pretty fast here. Russia does have ISR challenges as well. They do have space-based electronic intelligence satellites. These satellites are equipped with sensor-to-shooter capability, but they have a very limited number of them, according to open source space tracking estimates. This is just a picture I snapped just a couple days ago of those orbits. Now, those satellites are all in a low Earth orbit, which means they travel around the world. They're not locked in a particular position, and they travel very quickly. So they have about a 90 minute periodicity. So that means that from any one point on the Earth's globe, it takes them about 90 minutes to travel around the world. That means that there are gaps in coverage. So how do they want to cover those gaps? They want to cover them with airplanes, air-breathing ISR. Well, of course, they lack forward basing, they lack aircraft carriers, so they lack fighter escorts for those deep air-breathing ISR missions. So that limits the range of that aircraft. And it's also going to make it. Russia is not fighting in a vacuum here either. Russia's adversaries, NATO, the United States, or any coalition of the willing, will of course be practicing counter ISR techniques, and we can talk about that a little bit more, maybe in the question and answer session if you happen to be interested. So what this means is that finding ships at sea is a really hard problem. It's incredibly difficult. It sounds like it's easy. It's not. It's a big ocean out there. So Russia lacks the ability to find those targets. They can, and they will make great efforts to do so, but they understand that it is a much more easily solvable problem to strike fixed targets on shore. The ship against the shore is a much better sort of tactical calculus for the Russians than the ship against the ship. So it's a comparatively easier task. That doesn't mean that the Russian Navy will not go after other naval vessels. It just means that they will have a much easier time striking fixed targets at sea. Now, this has implications for sea lines of communication and so forth that I'll get into here in a few minutes. So what does a potential conflict look like? Well, in the threatening period, I would argue that based on Russian writings, you would see Russian deployments, heavy Russian deployments in the near sea, in the littoral zones, the coastal zones, and in the near sea to the sort of far sea zones. you would also probably see a limited number of cruise missile shooting submarines deploy across the Atlantic. Now, the United States Fleet Forces Command has been, as I'm sure folks from Canada know, has been very concerned about Russian submarines deploying to the east coast of the United States now, going on several years. And in particular here, we're talking about the new Yasen or Severodvinsk class of submarines. So this is what a deployment may look like in the threatening period. And again, the idea here is to sort of is to serve as a deterrence function, to threaten to impose cost in ways that would be unacceptable to their adversaries. But what about war? What if deterrence fails? Well, I would argue that based on what we know from Russian writing, you would see a great number of, at least in this theater, this is just one example, you would see a great number of Russian joint fires aimed at clearing out operational space in their immediate sort of zone of operations. In this example, we have joint fires emerging from the Kola Peninsula, the Kola Bay, the Barents Sea, in an attempt to kind of clear out or to thin out Norwegian early warning radars, coastal surveillance stations, airfields that are used for tactical aircraft like F-35s, and to clear out some operational space. And that would be followed up by these theater level strikes using long range precision guided munitions against places like Keflavik in Iceland or Åland in Norway or any number of bases in the UK. And that's that sort of campaign to confuse, to disorganize, to get out and strike using long range munitions as a way to both impose cost and to reduce damage done to Russia. So you might imagine this opens up a lot of challenges for a lot of risks for air and sea points of debarkation and for other fixed sites that can be easily attacked when you lack the order of battle and lack the ISR to go out and find those targets in the ocean. So what that does is it also expands the relative geography, that competitive geography I was talking about. If those northern Norwegian bases are now at risk or no longer functional or somehow degraded, that means that Russia's adversaries, I'm thinking in particular here, forgive me, of the United States, has to go farther to conduct those missions. Well, that imposes a lot of operational cost, right? How do you do that? Do you do that with land-based tactical aircraft to get up after those bomber missions that are flying in the Barents Sea, or to get out after some of those large surface combatants in the Barents Sea? Well, if you're going to use tactical aircraft, you need tankers. Those tankers may not exist. They may be called on for other purposes. You may need to use aircraft carriers. That means aircraft carriers need to go forward, exposing them to greater risk. And that's what I mean by this sort of blend of offense and defense. I'm not saying it is impossible. I'm saying that there are certain risks and costs associated with this that planners need to address themselves against. So I'm going to wrap up with this. How has the Ukraine War, what has the Ukraine War revealed, I should say, about Russian naval warfighting? What have we learned? What has Russia learned? Are there things that have been validated in Russia's war with Ukraine from the sort of Russian point of view? So first of all, we know that the Russian Navy, and they're proving it today, is capable of worldwide deployments and sustainments, at least in a permissive operating environment. The Pacific Fleet group of warships has been operating, as it says here, since mid-January. They're coming up on 200, around 200, maybe a little over 200 days of deployment in the Mediterranean. That's a long time. I'm not aware of any other navies that do that aside from maybe the United States occasionally. But that is a very long deployment. Obviously, it's going to have an effect on readiness on the back end, but this is the mission. Russia is fighting a war it takes very seriously. And a part of this mission is to keep that war localized to the Black Sea and not allow it to expand. This is a deterrent force in the Mediterranean that is showing the flag in an attempt to signal that it can impose cost if somebody else, such as NATO, wanted to intervene. Blockade operations. Now, there's been a lot of talk about blockades over the last couple of weeks, and I'm happy to go into more detail about that in the Q&A. But I would argue that Russia has very successfully maintained its blockade of Ukraine despite the loss of Snake Island. There was a very clear decision that was made over Snake Island to abandon it because the cost wasn't worth holding it, but they're still able to maintain that blockade. And that gets to another critical issue, which is naval losses. A lot was made of the sinking of the Moskva. And I don't want to minimize that. That was an important victory for Ukraine. But from a strategic perspective, I think the effect of that was minimal. Russia has only lost 2 large surface combatants in this conflict, which is pretty shocking when you think about how they've been operating this blockade. Some of those ships have been going forward. That tells us that the Russian Navy has actually been fairly successful against things that have been used either to shoot at it or to target it in the first place, that is ISR assets, so Bayraktars and so forth. Now, they have lost a handful of fast attack boats and small amphibs. Ukraine has been able to impose some costs in that department, but from a broader sort of operational and strategic perspective, that loss is manageable. It is war, losses happen, and I would argue that Russia's naval losses have been sustainable so far. One attack that's been very interesting is this attack on the Saratov LST, the landing ship that took place in Berdyansk here now several months ago. That's a really interesting event because what it wound up doing was showing the Russians that in fact their ideas about targeting maritime resupply at the pier are valid. That this is a good idea, that if a country like Ukraine can pull this off, then certainly the Russians can do it. So the Russians were trying to resupply troops in Berdyansk using LSTs that had to pull up to the pier and sit at fixed locations. Well, when Ukraine got that intelligence and knew that those ships were there, they were able to reach out and strike that vessel, that single vessel, with a precision strike munition. Well, that is exactly right out of the Russian playbook. And that is something I think that the Russians, in a sort of weird and perverse way, were able to learn as something that they can use to their advantage in the future. Also, Russian precision guided weapons in the Navy, that is Kaliber cruise missiles, that is the land attack version of the Kaliber cruise missile, has proven to be central to the war effort and extremely reliable. Those weapons have, I think, proven their worth to the Russian military. There are many reports emerging about the reliability of Kalibers compared to air-launched Russian cruise missiles that have proven to be somewhat less reliable, that have failed in flight or are not hitting targets or are landing on targets that are 100 yards away from the intended target. So Kalibers are not doing that. And what we're seeing is, at least according to Russian press statements, is that anytime there's a really critical strike or a really critical attack planned against important strategic targets, those strikes are being carried out by Kaliber missiles. That's not always true. That is not 100% the case, but they are really relying heavily on these missiles to conduct some of the most sort of strategically important attacks. And it's a sign of the success that they've been able to have with those missiles. Now, of course, Ukraine is holding out. Ukraine is holding out quite valiantly. And it is the case that these strikes with these missiles have not been enough, obviously, to defeat Ukraine. But it is worth noting that they have been pretty reliable weapons for Russia. Okay, so I'm going to end here with some dilemmas and implications here. And I'm going to step through this quickly so we can get to the Q&A. There are operational realities for Russia that clash with their strategic designs. When they want to hit these targets on land, they've got to fly through other countries. That's the bottom line. So if they want to hit Aviano Air Force Base from the Black Sea, Aviano is in Italy, they've got to fly through a bunch of the Balkan countries, many of which are allied to the United States. They have to strike that target in Italy. So this presents them with the dilemma of carrying out an operationally important mission at the strategic risk of widening the war. We know, at least based on Russian challenge studying how the Russians think about war, is for the US and NATO, logistics requirements are going to be extremely challenging. They're going to be expansive because we have a long way to go up into those bastions, whether they're in the Black Sea or in the Barents Sea, or even in the Baltic for that matter. Those logistics requirements are going to be challenging because Russia is going to do everything it can to push out to maximize that geographic distance. I'd also say that the bulk of Russian naval activity is not going to be focused on that Navy-on-Navy fight. I mentioned that. And when we hear conversations about SLOCs, we need some more analytic clarity on those conversations. Yes, transatlantic SLOCs may be at risk, but where do you want to buy that risk? I would argue if you have to buy risk, buy it in that transatlantic region, because it's the ends of the SLOCs that are at tremendous risk, right? It's the ports and the airfields. Those are the places that we should be more concerned about when we're talking about Russian attacks on sea lines of communication. So I think that bit of analytic clarity is useful from a planning perspective. I'm just about out of time here, so I think what I'll do is stop here and stop sharing my screen so we can get back to the Q&A. Thank you all very much in advance. I have really appreciated the opportunity to talk to you about this.
Thank you, Michael. Superb, fascinating, and comprehensive. There are such an array of issues that spring from your commentary, the way in which the relationship between the shore and the sea and the shore are blurred, and that's been illustrated in the Ukrainian conflict. I'm fascinated personally by the vast order of battle for what is in many ways a country without a very deep maritime history. When we look at the number of ships that are on that order of battle, what's interesting is the way in which they tend to fall into two broad categories. Those that were built before the end of the Cold War, and then a sort of hiatus during that period of remarkable confusion, which embraced the one-time Soviet Union, and then a rebuilding program, but a shift away from the giganticism of the Stalinist and post-Stalinist period into a fleet which is far smaller. I mean, in the sense that it relies on frigates and corvettes, also well equipped with missiles. A few exceptions, of course, the monster Belgorod submarine that's just been delivered into the hands of the RFN. But without taking up valuable Q&A time, because there have been a host of questions that sprung from your fascinating presentation, Michael. So let me turn to the first of the questions from our audience today. And the viewer asked, what does the Moskva sinking say about RFN ships and crews' ability to defend against ASBMs? Do these shortcomings have implications for Russia's broader naval goals? And let me give you one other, Michael, and then you can work on these, and then we'll come back to further questions. What are some of Russia's anti-ISR capabilities, particular space-based strategies? So I'll leave you with those two to begin with, and then we'll pick up the conversation in a moment.
Okay, great. Those are both really, I think, interesting and very important questions. I'll take the first one first. The implications of the sinking of Moskva. I think we should state the obvious here and follow along with Jim's really important point about the age of some of these ships. We all know Moskva was a very, very old ship. And if you talk to US Navy sailors, my deputy is a US Navy captain who took his ship over to Russian ports and did some port visits back before things got really, really bad, got aboard those ships and said, those things are basically held together by their paint. So there are some real issues with those older vessels. We don't know exactly what the sort of what the condition of the componentry was, or how well the systems were operating. We do know some things about the stowage of the radars. They did not appear to be slewed downrange and so forth. So it appears that the Moskva was taken by surprise. I would argue that it is likely that there were some challenges associated with, well, there were challenges associated with air defense, but those challenges include the simple fact that air defense at sea is incredibly, deeply, extraordinarily difficult. It's easy for us to say it can be done while we're sitting here on the shore, but unless you've actually looked at the suite of sensors that are out there trying to parse all the signal from the noise, and then have a skilled operator who is expert at hitting the right buttons and filtering out the right noise, then it's going to be it's a really difficult prospect. No matter what, it's very difficult. And that gets me to the second part of the question on the crews. The Russian Navy had been saying for quite a while that the only people that were going to sea were professional sailors. That is, people who were, they call them contract sailors, contract Niki. That doesn't mean that they were contractors in the sense that we understand it, but they were actual professional sailors. That's what it means in the Russian context, not conscripts, not one-year conscripts. So the Russian Navy had been claiming that anyone who was going to sea was a professional sailor. We know that now from the Moskva incident, that's not true, that the Russians are still sending these one-year conscripts to sea. And that may have had an effect as well, because we see that a lot of the sailors who returned, who were identified as returned from the Moskva, were contractors, or I'm sorry, were conscripts. So the quality of those crews may not be as high as we had initially thought they would be in terms of their professionalism. It takes a long time to learn how to do those very, very difficult tasks, and a one-year conscript is just going to struggle mightily with these kinds of things. On the question of counter-ISR capabilities and counter-ISR tactics, this is one of the things that Russia has put a tremendous amount of focus in over the last, call it 30 years. Even in that hiatus that Jim was referring to, Russia was spending a lot of its R&D dollars on figuring out how to conduct counter-ISR, that either against space-based missions or air-breathing missions or land-based sensors, whatever those may be. So now Russia, I think, even surpassing that of China, has the most advanced suite of electronic warfare capabilities on Earth. That is electronic attack capabilities, jamming capabilities, obscuring capabilities. Whether or not those are as effective as advertised is beginning, I think, to come into question here because of the Ukraine war. Now, I'm not in a position to say, I haven't seen a lot of reporting, open source reporting on these kinds of things, and I don't know what's happening at the classified level. Certainly things might be a little spicier at the classified level. But in terms of the open source reporting, we just don't know enough about what has actually been happening in Ukraine with regard to the battle of the sort of electronic warfare systems. But I will say that this has been a priority area for Russia, especially counter-ISR, that is keeping the United States and its allies from sensing them, because they know that we rely so heavily on our ISR systems for precision strike. So they're doing everything they can to frustrate that ISR system and to slow it down, whether that's via cyber capabilities, jammers, obscurance, or whatever it is that I mentioned just a moment ago. And the operational tactical reason for that is because they're just trying to stay ahead, right? The idea is to move more quickly and stay one step ahead. So I hope that answers the question.
Well, I had the good fortune of visiting Vladivostok 4 times over the space of about 16 years. In fact, in 1990, I was on the first Western warship, I believe since 1937, to visit Vladivostok, which was then a closed port even to Soviet citizens. And in 1998, I was back in Vladivostok, and our host ship was Boutilier, a big, brutish warship. And The word that we received was that the captain had turned to his seniors and asked for back pay for the crew, 6 months in arrears, and paint. And he had gotten paint. And you could see that everything that moved or didn't move had been painted. But the telltale issue was the marine growth below the waterline, which suggested that the ship had barely been to sea in the previous year. So it strikes me that the Russians are the only people that I've encountered that build brand new buildings that are 50 years old the day they're open. And I always wonder about the maintenance culture when it comes to highly sophisticated war machines like warships. Let me turn to some further questions, Michael, if I may. How is the warming Arctic affecting the RFN strategy there? Could the Eastern fleets deploy to the Pacific? And let me give you one further question. What would the role of the RFN Pacific Fleet be against the Quad in a broader conflict? Would it cooperate with the PLAN? So two other questions for you to work at.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll try to be brief. The answer on the Arctic question, how is a warming Arctic affecting Russian naval strategy? It is very deeply affecting Russian naval strategy. In fact, in the shameless self-promotion department, I will tell you that our institute has published a number of translations of Russia's Arctic strategy, their naval strategy and their naval doctrine, including their maritime doctrine. And by the way, there's a brand new maritime doctrine that has just been released in the last, I guess it's, last 10 days. And we will have that out in translation, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 days. In any case, you can read those documents and see how the Arctic is a fundamental component of Russian strategy. And that sort of, the way they sort of view the Arctic has been shifting as the Arctic has been warming. Russia is a global power. Now, that's an obvious statement to make, but it's worth thinking about what that actually means. From east to west, that means that Russia is a power from east to west. How do they move power east to west? Well, they want to do it via the Northern Sea Route that they believe will be open for longer stretches of the year, and that they believe in those stretches in which it's closed. Of course, they can deploy icebreakers to move troops, to move equipment across the Northern Sea Route by water routes, of course. So that is the Northern Sea Route. But as I mentioned, Russia is also building a series of military bases along its northern coast, along the Arctic coast, kind of following the Northern Sea Route, in part to defend the Northern Sea Route, but also they've built 10,000-foot runways at these bases. Now, a lot of people have looked at them and said, well, Russia wants to forward stage bombers there. That may be true. I'm really skeptical of that because I think it puts that limited number of strategic bombers at great risk. But if you read what the Russians themselves are saying about those bases and those long runways, they're there to provide the ability to reinforce by air. So they can bring in large transport aircraft and large transport aircraft and deploy heavy systems like air defense systems and others if they desire to. That's not to say that they wouldn't deploy offensive systems to those bases. It's just to say that the primary goal is deploying defensive systems. So yes, the Arctic is very much changing their strategy. The Russians practice every single year amphibious deployments from east to west and west to east. So they'll send an amphibious ship filled with troops through the Northern Sea Route and land them on the coast of the Chukchi Sea. So it is a very serious sort of project that the Russians have given themselves. Now, anybody who has navigated in icy waters knows that we say that the Arctic is warming. It doesn't mean that pack ice breaks away and floats and can cause tremendous damage to ships. I don't need to tell this audience that. You know this better than I do. It can cause tremendous damage to ships. So navigation, and it can also force ships into different navigation and less well-charted navigation channels. which of course presents other risks as well. So this sort of reliance on the warming Arctic is not without risk for the Russians. The last thing I'll say about that is that it's extraordinarily expensive to operate up there. And you can imagine that there are not that many Russians who want to deploy all the way up to those bases and spend, a year or 2 or 3 or however long they might get stuck there, deployed in that environment. So the role of the Pacific Fleet in a conflict against the Quad and potential cooperation with the PLA. I think I'd like to take that in a sort of broader perspective. And take the second question first. The Russian cooperation with China is real. It's especially real at the operational level, and it's also quite real, of course, as we know, at the sort of national political level. But that cooperation will come as no surprise to anyone, has its limits. I like to characterize it as a kind of it's a negative relationship, not necessarily a positive relationship. There are tremendous areas of distrust. Despite what the various ministers of defense, what the heads of state, what the heads of navies have said about operating together. On some level, yes, they do operate together. They may even be able to develop a common operating picture. I don't know that for sure, but much even new Chinese equipment is based on Russian equipment because the Chinese have based so much of their work on Russian imports that they were receiving in years past. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that equipment could be possibly interoperable. But as I said, there are limits to that cooperation. There's a reason why you never see Russian nuclear submarines showing up in exercises with the Chinese. It's because the Russians do not want the Chinese to practice listening to Russian nuclear-powered submarines, which they view as the ace in the hole in any conflict that they have at sea. So they don't trust the Chinese not to collect on those submarines when they're deployed. The Russians are not sharing nuclear submarine technology with the Chinese. So there are these very specific limits on that. Now, when it comes to operational warfighting, yes, it's certainly possible, and it depends on the strategic interests in place at the time. I think the Chinese might have some kind of vested interest in cooperating with the Russians, but it is also distinctly possible that they might let the Russians and the US punch themselves out and sort of maybe feed the Russians just enough to be competitive against the United States. Because right now in the Pacific, the Russian fleet is not competitive, though I think that's likely to change in the next 5 years quite substantially in the next 5 years. But in any case, I'm skeptical of real thoroughgoing cooperation that results in a broader sort of Russo-Chinese military pact, or sort of broad sort of cooperation in a war against the Quad. I think there are real limits on the ability of those countries to do that.
Wonderful. Well, I can't thank you enough, Michael. It was an absolutely superb presentation, buttressed by equally superb answers in the Q&A section. And I eagerly look forward, personally and professionally, to meeting you in Victoria when you're out for MSC 2022 in mid-November. I'd like to alert our viewers today that a video of this webinar is available on YouTube. If you search for MSC conference, all one word, on your YouTube, you'll find a video record of this presentation and ongoing discussion. It's my pleasure to, of course, thank MSC partners, the Navy League of Canada, and the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Waikiki in Hawaii, long and faithful supporters of the MSC initiative. And to thank our sponsors, Lockheed Martin, MDA, General Dynamics, Hawkeye 360, and Davie Shipbuilding. Again, loyal and active sponsors and supporters. We are deeply indebted to your enthusiastic support over the years of MSc. And to thank our audience today, our 11 webinar presentations in the COVID era have, I think, been an outstanding opportunity to engage a wide variety of viewers and to share with them the latest developments in the maritime realm. And I would certainly encourage and urge viewers to register for the in-person MSc here in Victoria in November. The registration is at www.mscconference, all one word, .com. Register by the 27th of September to take advantage of the early bird rates. So that brings to an end our session for today. Once again, it was an honor and a pleasure to moderate this webinar and to thank our presenter, Professor Michael Petersen from the US Naval War College. Thank you.
Two, one.
At Lockheed Martin, we're on a mission. Your mission. When millions of people are counting on you, you can count on us. To build the impossible, to invent the inconceivable, and solve every problem with speed and reliability. Every mission is an expedition of the greatest importance, both to you and to us.